Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Do Good to Lead Well podcast series. I'm your host, Craig Dowden, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you join us today. For those of you who are veterans of this podcast, welcome back. Always love to have your comments and insights. For those of you new to the Do Good to Lead Well universe, a very warm welcome. My name is Craig Dowden, your host, and this series was created in advance of my first book, Do Good to Lead Well. And I had the profound privilege of speaking with best-selling authors, TED speakers, to share their expertise, their insights. And a few years ago, broaden the audience to include extraordinary chief executives, presidents who we can learn from in terms of their leadership journey and their leadership insights. And because of your ongoing support, Do Good to Lead Well is now ranked in the top 0.5% of podcasts globally. So thank you so much for that honor. And it's because of your ongoing feedback, ideas, suggestions, social shares, likes, which really has enabled that to happen. And the primary reason for the popularity of the podcast is because of the amazing guests that I have the privilege to speak with. And today is no exception. I've been really excited to speak with Justine for some time. I'm going to give the high-level bio. I could go for most of the hour going through. Justine Hendricks is president and CEO at FCC, Canada's leading agriculture and food lender. She comes to FCC after 17 years with Export Development Canada, EDC, and 7 years with the Royal Bank of Canada. Her diverse experience includes delivering financial services on the front line, leading successful organizational transformations, evolving risk management capabilities, spearheading the development of innovative financial products, and developing and executing corporate strategies. So you can see amazing experience and really excited to dig into this. Justine has received several awards for her leadership and is very well known for mobilizing and listening to her teams, something I'm excited to dig into because sometimes, maybe often, that listening piece can be missing in conversations today. So this is great. She's a member of the University of Ottawa Board of Governors and currently sits on their audit committee. She also volunteers extensively and currently serves as chair of the Digital Opportunity Trust. She earned an MBA from the University of Ottawa and a bachelor's degree from Carleton University. So Justine, a very warm welcome to the Do Good to Lead Well podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Same here, Craig. I know we've been planning to do this for a while, so I'm really happy that we're joining for a great chat today. I know it's going to be lots of fun.
Absolutely. I love being from Newfoundland. Turning this into a Newfoundland kitchen party is always high on my list. And I know from our initial conversation, so much great energy and enthusiasm and passion for leadership. And let's start there, right? Like there's so much of an emphasis on leadership these days. It's at the forefront in every single domain that you look at. And so when you look at leadership and your own leadership journey, what do you feel are the crucial qualities that leaders need to possess, both for leading today and into tomorrow?
It's a really nice way to start the conversation, I think, Craig. So there's a word that comes to mind that I think is in my mind is the most important. And I come at it because especially I think when you become a CEO, we all have the path that got us to become a CEO. But when you're the CEO, you have a preview to everything, and you may not have seen or have experience in everything in the organization. So for me, the word that's super important is curiosity, right? And I think when you become a CEO, obviously, the buck stops with you and all these decisions stop with you, but your ability to every day to remain curious. And that curiosity can be because in the early days you're learning about the organization. It can be about something happens like a crisis, and if you don't remain curious to really understand what it's about first before you jump to solution, that can get you into trouble, right? So always having an open mind to understand a different perspective, I think, is critical. The second word that comes to mind, Craig, I think it's the ability to communicate. Because as a CEO, And combined with that, as I was reflecting on the question, being able to demonstrate your accessibility, I also, for me, is something that is really important. The last thing I want is the staff to think that they can never get to the CEO. And it's a delicate balance, right? Because you obviously have different responsibilities. So between accessibility and the ability to communicate and using your curiosity, I think you're set yourself up so that as different opportunities, adventures, you name it, come your way, it really allows you to navigate those. And I'd suggest that in this day and age, the situations are frequent, accelerated, complicated on a daily basis. So if you're not able to kind of turn your blank sheet of paper and be able to reset yourself to be able to deal with the next problem, I'll say, it becomes pretty tough, right? So
Mhm.
that's probably what comes to mind as you kicked off with your question.
Well, I love that, and this is exactly why I was so excited to have this discussion. I'm going to kind of reverse engineer it because I want to go back to the last point that you shared because I think that's so powerful when you talked about the frequency and then also the accelerated pace of challenges. And I had the privilege of welcoming Ed Hess. He's a professor emeritus out of Dowden, and he had a great quote that aligns so beautifully with what you said. He said, "Our success in this world is going to be predicated on the speed with which we learn, unlearn, and relearn." And that's
Totally.
just beautifully what you just shared. So thank you for that. I love the two things. We are going to dig deep on this because I think it's awesome. No, that curiosity piece, because what's interesting to me, and I have, as I mentioned, just such a privilege to speak with CEOs and really amazingly successful CEOs like yourself. And that spirit of curiosity, sometimes people can think, oh, well, I've landed, right? I'm in the corner office, I'm president, I'm CEO. And now it's almost like, so now it's my job to convey all of the insight from Mount Knowledge down. Can you talk about how you've been able to take that and wonderful step and that realization around, you know what, curiosity is going to serve me more as a president and CEO? What's enabled you? What's that path been like? Because for many, it's almost like, oh, well, now I've got this figured out, right? I'm done. Talk to
Yeah.
us about that. I think that's so good.
Yeah, no, so I love where you're going. And to be honest with you, Craig, I never thought about it that way. So
Mm,
I would say, in all honesty, I think it's a little bit part of who I am. So, as I've grown up in different organizations, and I've had the privilege, I would say, and I would recommend to anybody to be able to do that, is a lot of my career has been around serving the public. And I think early in my days, I learned to appreciate and to try to put myself in other people's shoes. And that's where I realized the benefit and how curiosity can really, either it keeps you humble, helps you dig deeper, and then I just find it paints the picture to where you have to go next clearer than if you always depend on how you've done it in the past, right? And I'm sure you've been in those situations where you may have reported to somebody that they come across as, well, I've done it all, so I have all the experience. And I think that can work to a certain extent, but I think the way things are evolving and changing, um, back to you, learn, unlearn, and relearn, that's become the name of the game. So I think, and I can appreciate that not everybody may have that as a natural tendency, but if you really allow yourself to just listen, quite frankly, and you'll give the chance to others to tell their story, it's never cheated me in terms of finding, connecting something, finding a solution, or enlightening me on something that actually I wasn't even aware of. So I found that as you cultivate that, no pun intended, you just kind of want more. Like, it's, yeah.
I love the pun. That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. So, and you're raising so many great points. I'm so glad we started here, um, around that curiosity. And there's another word you used that I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, Justine. You talked about humble, like that
Yeah.
curiosity feeds into being humble. can you talk more about that? Because again, as CEOs, and this is why I love having these conversations, that can challenge some people's conventional ideas about, well, humble, that's going to get in the way of me being successful as a CEO. And I love that you're rightly pointing that out and going, no, humility is a superpower for a CEO. You want to be more. So can you talk to us a little more around that?
Yeah, and I would say, Craig. So the role that I have, which I simply adore, is fascinating in many ways. So as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, right? I lead the financial institution that's solely dedicated to food. Period. Right, the whole value chain. So I'll be in the field with farmers. I'll be in the really highly sophisticated manufacturing facilities and pretty much everything in between. So my mind goes at many different levels, and but I've learned along the way that I think behind all of these different experiences, there's an individual that had an idea one day. So I admire people that have ideas, right? And I may surprise you, but I admire their courage, right? Because I come to the table saying, well, I have kind of a box around me that creates this opportunity for me to lead. But those that started from scratch, in my humble opinion, I really took my hat off to them. And I think when you work in the space that I work, I'm also a big Team Canada type girl, right? So I go, everything that these people are doing is for the better, and we're feeding the world and so forth. So I think when you bring that humility, and I guess I have this admiration, the impact that that has on whoever you're talking to is I think what opens them up to actually letting you in, right? So versus, and for me it becomes part of connecting with whoever I'm engaging with. And there isn't one time, and at the risk of it sounding corny, like there is not one time that I walk away that I don't learn something, or actually just walk away appreciating how, human beings are more similar than we think. Or like you just make these different connections that make you go home at night and say, you know what, we are in this together. And then, to be honest with you, it takes a bit of pressure off, because I think if I, as the CEO, I'm always thinking I have to be the one that's right, then I'm not paying attention, right? Because I'm thinking, what do I have to say, what do I have to say? So I found that I'm in a much better position to influence when I can be humble about it. And I've learned this too, I'd say, Craig, in the latter part of my career, not in the early days. The strength behind asking for help is so powerful. And 15, 20 years ago, that was definitely a sign of weakness, right? Like, they didn't teach you that it was okay to either be wrong, ask for help, seek clarification. Those are things that were not seen as a strength. So now you're kind of seeing this shift, right? And I think those that are leveraging it, I think we're seeing the benefit of it, because I think it helps you connect, actually. And I also come to the table, Craig, recognizing that the other day I was actually telling some of my staff, I wish I didn't have these three letters sometimes. Right? Because when people see you come in and they say the CEO, it creates a perception in their mind. And sometimes the biggest challenge we have, I think it is, and I use humility to get there, is for actually people to realize that we're people just like they are. And then you can have this really cool conversation, versus thinking that each party has to play a certain role that's connected, in my case, to the three letters CEO.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Such great insight. And again, so much is resonating with me, that what you're saying, Justine. And I want to slow the tape down for people in terms of, because relationships are everything, right?
Yeah.
Our relationships are so critical, personally and professionally. And I love the observation you made around bringing a philosophy of humility, being humble when engaging with others, the impact that it has, and how it facilitates people letting us in, building trust. So vitally important. And
Hmm.
I think that is so, and also coupled with, and you touched on this right at the outset, that curiosity as well, how those two things go together. And then just how the impact that has on people, and how we are able to, and again, I love what you're saying, like rather than thinking about how do I sound smart, or what do I want to learn from you, how can I learn from you, like what is important to you, this is so great. I just think it's once again, it's amazing. uh, you also touched on something else which I think is so valuable, and talking about that curiosity in the context of crisis,
Mhm.
or in the context of, well, there's a problem, and then people jump to solutions, like just, okay, let's act.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that for us? Because I think what you're sharing is so critical. There's this crisis or problem, and then the reaction tends to be, let's do things. Can you talk to us through, like, how can we slow ourselves down? And then what's the benefit of taking that extra time to reflect before we act?
Yeah. Oh, that is a really good one. So before I'll even go to reflect, Craig, the other thing I'd add to the conversation is I actually think it's you have to open your eyes and observe, right? So, and I'm thinking of which leads you to a reflection. But if you can allow me for a second, like I'm thinking of when the sad events around George Floyd happened, right? And there's a lot of anger and energy, and people were looking to react, and I think different organizations live different things, regardless of where you're around the world. But then I think, so I can remember the organization where I was when that happened, and we went through kind of our, I'll say, mini crisis, so to speak. But there was something underlying that was coming through, and if you acted too quickly, you were going to miss it, right? And so to me, this opening your eyes, and when something's happening, and I don't know if I'm getting to the conversation you're looking for, but it's even to look at what are some of the words that people are saying. Are they bringing up things that may have happened 5 years ago that is feeding the crisis, or is it just an event that's in front of you? And what I've seen is typically a trigger event brings up things that have been accumulated in the past. So I think, so there's always what you have to deal with in front of you, right? Like you got to do something, but I would suggest don't ignore what's underneath, because that might be your crisis, not the short term one. And if you don't take the time to really reflect on that, and ask yourself whether or not you need to do something about that, you're only pushing down the line something else to happen, and the next time it'll be worse, right? And it's hard, right? It seems easy to just articulate it, but it's super hard in a time where things are moving fast, there's high expectation, like all of those things. But to have that ability to say, well, let's pause for a second and really look at what's going on, I think is what I would say in response to your question.
It's exactly, I love where this is going. I think it's great, and thank you for sharing that specific example, and then talking about, okay, what's the macro, so what are some things that are coming along with this. And I love your point, which, as you say, there can be a triggering event, and then there can be a lot of things that are leading up to that, and the power of observation. And you also talk about the power of words. And I think
Yeah.
you are really touching on something important, if I may, because I'd love to, if you can drill even further into that, to raise our awareness, our empathy, our understanding, our observational skills about what you've seen when people are, certain words that bubble up, and then things that we can look for. Because I think what you're touching on, and again, I love this as a coach in my practice, being like, okay, what words are people using? I'd love to get your experience on this and some takeaways that we can reflect on.
Yeah. I find it interesting that you're asking about this, because if I look at the organization that I have the honor of leading today, Craig, we are going through some changes, and we've done a new strategy which is super, super exciting. And actually, it's the curiosity and my genuine interest in people's well-being, which I believe I come to the table with, made me realize, and I think a lot of organizations are in that situation, right? You have organizations that have customer facing staff, right, that are kind of every single day, kind of facing that churn and over. If you haven't done it, it's hard to understand, but it's high pressure. It puts it can be exhausting at times, right? Because you never get a break, right? You feel like you're never getting a break. You're always on. And then I think in an organization, the risk is you get this debate around the front office or the back office. So
Uh,
the front office feels like they're taking all the weight and holding up everything. Front office thinks back office doesn't understand them. But you probably know where those conversations come from. But I do think that it's as the CEO, my job is to find a way to acknowledge that. And I've just literally finished a 3-week cross Canada tour with my organization. And as I found myself, especially connecting with people in the front office, I'd actually start off and I'd say, hey, before we get going, I want to share with you one of the words of the English vocabulary that I'm not a big fan of, and hopefully you'll chuckle as they did. I said it's transformation. And then they'd look at me and say, well, Justine, every memo you send has the word transformation because since you've arrived, there's this big change. And I said, I know. So that's why I'm sharing it with you. But then I said, let me explain to you why. Right. Because and I would take the opportunity to acknowledge that how a word can trigger an emotion. And I said, so even me, when I think of transformation, I think of, oh, well, everything I did before isn't good enough because I totally have to change it. Right. This is going to be big. Right. Like, it's heavy. Oh, my God. Like, I'm not going to know, like all these different emotions. And then I would go and say, and this is what I want to share with you is I want each of you to know and to hear from me first that all of these things that we're looking to change is in service of one thing, what we've been doing for 65 years, and that's not going to change. But I believe as a leader, if we don't make the effort to connect that and use whatever word it is, right? Call it out or put it on your hand and put it out there. I think we're failing our staff because they're looking to hear from you that it was okay, right? We're going towards something together. And this is where, and I'm still practicing learning with it, Craig, because I'm very transparent with my staff. And but sometimes I try to have fun with it too, right? And to say, hey, I get it. Because I think when they see that you get it, you kind of whoop, they open up a little bit more, and then you can have the conversation.
well, and this is such, thank you for the personal example and real time example.
Yeah, yeah,
That's amazing. The
yeah,
timing couldn't be better. And I love what you're talking about, Justine, in terms of like recognizing the power of words, and then also how the same word can land differently for different
oh
people,
yeah,
being
yeah,
mindful of that. And I have a follow-up question because I think this is wonderful, and already I'm struck by that. The curiosity that you talk about, you can just see through every answer. It's a through line. I'm 1000% confident that people, listening to the episode, coaching clients that I'd have be, wow, how did Justine admit that transformation, something that basically is, transformation, Justine, that this is a word I don't like. What gave you the courage? You talked about courage earlier to be open around that, recognizing that people saw
yeah.
you in transformation, because I think it's so powerful what you're talking about and the impact that it had. Can you share how you were able to go, you know what, I'm gonna say this and I'm gonna be transparent, have the
Yeah,
courage to be so open?
yeah. Well, maybe if we ever have a part two, Craig, maybe the change management team's booking a meeting with me on Monday, and I might get some coaching on that. Um,
A
because
follow-up episode, yeah,
a
exactly.
follow-up effort.
That's
No, but in all seriousness, I'm one of these people, Craig, that I try as I've gotten a bit older, not necessarily wiser. The promise I made to myself is to try to be consistent.
mm,
And so when I started this job, and when you start a job as a CEO, what's the question people ask you? What's your plan in your first 100 days? What's your vision? What's the quick learning or what's your early observation, right? So when people would ask me early on, what's my vision? I would always say this: I actually don't have one. I came to the table with a blank sheet of paper. And my job in the next 100 days, that's why I want to go out and do all of that stuff because we're going to build it together. So that was one thing. And then what I promised to every employee is I said, as I'm stepping into this role and I'm like realizing the importance of the role that I have, this thing that scares me the most is that, hey, I know I'm not going to always be liked, right? And I'm going to have to make decisions that I actually know some of you will disagree with. So, and then I said to the staff, but I'll make you one promise is that no matter what, I'll always give you the context. And that's probably, Craig, what I lean on when I say something like, I don't like the word transformation. Framework is another word that I actually don't like at all. And people tease me all the time for it. But I just, I use that as a way so that hopefully people can say, hey, she's not a textbook, right? Because I think the risk we have when we become a leader, and that there's things out there, frameworks that are so good, but to me, when you use the buzzwords all the time, I think it actually takes away from your humility in a way. So that's what I would say, Craig, is what gives me the courage. And I guess part of that courage is to recognize that not everybody might agree. And accepting that not everybody's going to agree with me is part of the journey versus making the journey trying to convince everybody to agree with you, right? So once you and these last few weeks, because we are doing a very big change, we would share with the staff in terms of how do you deal with change. And one of my pieces of advice was for folks to say, focus on what you can control. If you let your mind go on everything around that you don't control, I said that takes your energy away from the things that you're probably super good at, what you can focus on, and trust that we're going to take care of that. Obviously, be curious and ask your questions, but just try to focus on what you can control, right? And that, I think, over time gives you that confidence kind of to keep on going.
No, absolutely. And so much great insight here. And particularly, again, on a resilience or stress management side, what can I control? What's outside of my control? How can I maximize my influences situation and then also recognize where I'm unable to
Uh,
influence a particular situation? Such incredible balance in that. And also appreciate, as you say, just having a conversation and a human connection. And you touched on this earlier, Justine, about, well, we're all people too. Like, regardless of the letters or numbers after our names, we are human beings on a human journey. And so being able to facilitate that happening is so important. There's another point you made which I'd love to, and again, it's just sparking questions that I'm sure people are wondering about. I love how you said, hey, what's your vision? And then most might say, okay, I need to have that, right? Like,
yeah.
as soon as someone asks. And so what would you say for people who go, wow, like, will they think, well, you should have a vision? Or, how come what if they tell you things you don't want to put into your vision? You're offering co-creation, yet what if people come up with really ideas that are off where you want to go? I'd love to hear,
Oh,
once again, how you embrace that and see the power of that for those that are deer in the headlights, kind of like, oh, this
yeah.
is danger, danger.
Yeah, no. And that's fair. I appreciate kind of the well, not the challenge, but you like poking at this. I guess what I'd say, Craig, is it starts off by usually you get appointed to be a CEO, right? You're selected by a group. So I think it becomes really important. I think there's the journey for a CEO probably starts in that selection process. And again, we're in the context of a podcast around leadership and how leadership is changing today. I can share with you that when I went through this journey, the little chat I had with myself is the only way you're going to get this job is you better be true to yourself, because if
Mm.
you get this job without being true to yourself, your energy will be spent on maintaining that first and not probably doing what you want to do. And that, I think, starts with every individual has to be able to have that conversation. So then you get the job, right? And I think, understanding what you're coming to this organization with as a mandate. Are you there to be stable? Are you stabilizing? Are you there to change and so forth? That's the second piece. And to me, those end up being the components when you start with a blank sheet of paper that you should leverage to sift through those that might push you here versus those that might push you there. So that's what you should come to the table with, right? Am I here to change? Am I here to grow? Am I here to shrink? What am I here for? And understand what that means first. And I then, as you converse, I'm confident that you can, make the balance between which one you put more weight. And the other one too is, I think at the end of the day, because I mean, still it doesn't make it easy, but to me, uh, I would challenge you to share examples of organizations or CEOs that have come into companies with their, let's say, their vision full stop, and been super successful at implementing it. Yeah.
I love it. I love, and what's really great, and this is why I love that we're digging into this and playing around with it, because there can be this idea that, hey, I've got to have that vision figured out. It's the answer that I have to bring forward. And there's so much research and evidence that shows that when we co-create things, it's so
It's
much
way
more powerful. The engagement is a lot higher. Yet we can almost, our egos, you talked about humility earlier, can get in the way of that
right.
conversation. And I think it's so, and again, there's so many great points that you're making throughout our conversation, Justine. You talked about earlier, not having all the pressure of having the right answer or the only, now you get everybody else's input and their ideas. And it doesn't mean you have to agree. I love the intentionality that you're bringing to this. I know who I am. I know what my mandate is. Let's talk about it. And it doesn't mean it diverts me from where I need to go.
Nope.
It expands my thinking. It allows me to understand the context. This is just fantastic. And I'm so glad that you're delving into this so deeply and concisely, because there's so much people can hear these ideas and then, now how do I operationalize? And I just think it's so great that you're going, let's get even further down, right,
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
this. I love it. I think it's so wonderful. uh Another point you made, and this is queuing me up beautifully, because you talked about being true to yourself. And again,
Yeah.
I think that's so important. I'm going to paraphrase, because it's just a message that really resonated with me. It's almost like it's better to fail being me than try to figure this out and not get something being someone else. So like understanding who I am. And I love that that's first in
Yeah.
that piece before you're like, okay, and now the context, why am I here? Authentic leadership is, it's really a topic of focus within leadership these days. And so what does that idea of authentic leadership, being true to yourself, mean to you? And can you be too authentic? And I'll add another question. I'm probably going to have multiple questions on this. um, what about someone who's not sure who they are, how to be true to themselves? If you can touch on those pieces. So I'm really glad you opened the door to this one.
Yeah. So let me jump right through it, Craig? So, okay, first of all, of humility or authenticity. So the first thing I'd say about that is, I agree, Craig. There's a lot of conversation about it, and I think part of the debate, and I don't have the answer, is can you learn to be authentic, or like, are you born with the potential, or are you born authentic versus it's not as much natural for you to do so? And we could probably have a whole podcast about that. And right, and
Part
I'm
three.
thinking that, yeah, part three. But there's a part of me that thinks that once you learn how to be as true to yourself as possible, I think that creates the ability for your authenticity to shine, right? And then you need to know, like, some, it's not that you're not always authentic, but different situations call upon different you know what's the word I'm looking for, different intensity, right, of some of your characteristics. So but I think the reason why authenticity is so important, and I've certainly seen it in my job, is that when you can be authentic, or when your authentic self comes through, I think that's where you connect with another human being.
Yeah.
And if I was to push out to, in life, we wish everything goes always well. And in my world, when you deal with finances, there's some good times and there's some tough times. And there's nothing like a tough time to test that authentic relationship. And I fundamentally believe that it's that authenticity, or that ability for two individuals to sit down and have an honest conversation, that allows you to persevere, right? And that allows you to not make it about you winning or losing, but to be able to kind of solve. And you don't always, sometimes you're the party in front of you may not be authentic, right? But I guess the way I sleep at night is, I say, if I know that I did it well and I was authentic, I sleep at night. If I didn't, I don't. So it's but I think it's something that, depending on how you were brought up, like I said, it can have been something rewarded or something punished over the years. And once upon a time, not that long ago, authenticity wasn't in the top five capabilities of a leader, right? It wasn't that at all. So, right, like, and still, I haven't done enough research on this, but I think, even if I look at in some of the schools and things like that, or a lot of the models that, when you become in these leaders and you're coached on, that have thousands and thousands of data points, authenticity, I'm not convinced, is one of them, because that wasn't a data point that was important before. So I sometimes wonder, as these models evolve, we talk about authenticity, but are they comparing us to like a different type of data set?
Mm.
Um, and then maybe the other thing you asked about, can you be too authentic? And, or, could that lead to something maybe not as positive? Yeah, I think it can, right? I think people can take advantage of you, right? That's the risk,
Yeah.
right? And I think it happens, like, it's
Mm.
that's almost what you have to be willing to face, is that someday somebody will take advantage of it. And then you kind of lean back on that authenticity to how you handle it. But yeah, it's not the it's I don't think we're preaching a silver bullet to solving all problems, right? Like, it can put you into some situations, yeah, that could be pretty painful too.
Well, and thank you. This is again a really rich discussion around not just a hot topic. It's also a complex and nuanced one. So I
Yeah, yeah,
appreciate how we're approaching this. And to me, I love a, a phrase that you use is almost like learning how to be true to ourselves.
yeah,
That's so important, and recognizing that. And another point that you made that I really want to shine a light on for people who are listening, because you were talking about, okay, I'm in a situation and now I have choices. There's an intentionality around how I can be authentic.
yeah,
And that is really great, because to build on what you shared, which I think is so powerful and important, Justine, is that if you just show up in every conversation and it's 100%, right? Like it's just on 100 blast of authentic. Well, once again, that can create challenges. That can understandably create some conflict and friction in conversations and relationships. And it's recognizing, okay, who I am, being true to me in this situation, what the situation requires. And I love that balance that you're bringing to this discussion around being mindful of that,
yeah,
because that's an important choice. Uh, at the beginning as well, I want to dig into this because another very important element of conversation these days is listening. So, talked about how you've been widely recognized, commended, awarded, and in particular on your ability to mobilize and to listen. Once again, something that people hear. What do you think are the skills, the practices of people who listen very well, kind of do a master class on listening? And what do you find are some of the skills or practices of people who think they're awesome at listening? They're really not,
yeah,
they're not getting it. They're there, they're hearing what's being
yeah.
said. They're not really listening or understanding. So I'd love to get your take.
Oh, so once Craig, we had a coach as a team that made us do this exercise, and it was about listening. And if I may, I'll share it, because it was a super hard exercise, but it was very telling. So this coach uh, threw a topic out there that we were about five people that needed to talk about it. So it's almost like if he would throw it first to you, Craig, and then you'd start to talk. And then at one point, the coach would stop, and then he'd say, "Okay, Craig, you need to turn it over to Justine." My job, before I could add my point, was to paraphrase what you said.
Right.
And and but it's like, talk about a conversation slowing down, because everybody, what are we at human beings? We're so eager to get into the conversation and to get our point in. Half of the time you don't even listen to what your colleague said before. But like, so that would be, hey, if anybody wanted to do this test, I thought of all the things I've ever done in my life, that was the best example of bringing to the surface what happens when you don't listen. And just, you know what I mean, in a fun way too. So it was fun. It wasn't like, oh, thou shall, and you didn't do it. But when you have to paraphrase everything your colleague said, and then you can get your point, either your point, you forget it, so you realize maybe that wasn't that much of an important point to begin with, or B, your brain really starts to work differently, because you got to keep track of what you want to say, but you also realize that you need to focus on what was there before. And I
Mm.
think a lot of us, I'm sure you've participated in these meetings where people show up in the meeting and they're there physically, and then, but they're not focused, right? And then they go to the next meeting, and sometimes the next meeting is related to the one before, and they just look at it as a silo. So that was kind of my first, like,
Mm.
maybe my little anecdote in terms of testing. um, and this will might seem super simplistic, Craig, but one of the things somebody once told me, and I find it especially when you're going to see customers, like, and it's regardless whether you're a CEO or anybody, you take your phone and you leave it in the car. And I must admit, it took somebody telling me, uh, noticing that I did it, that I put my phone in the car, for me to realize, I guess, how few people do that. But that actually creates, and then, sometimes you just have to, again, it's what can you control? Let go that what's about to happen while you spend this hour with this individual. That individual is equally investing time in you as you are in them. And in my situation, it's typically me asking them to share their story. So the least I could do is to be there and listen, right? And I've had people comment on me that customers have noticed that. So it made me realize, like, wow, how many of us are walking with this phone all the time, and just so tempted to open it, and then not realizing it's a dual effect. One, you're not listening. And I think two, it's the impression that you're giving. It is that you're not there and you're not being attentive, because you're not, right? You're allowing yourself to be distracted. So the boundary setting of, this is a time where I'm there to focus, again, so simplistic. It takes a lot of discipline, but I think it pays off, because anything as a leader that then you have to connect the dots for, I say to people all the time, that's where I get my ideas. They didn't come from my brain. It comes from, paying attention and connecting the dots, because I don't come with knowing everything. So the ability to learn, as you say, learn, unlearn, relearn, is you do that by listening, and then you start to figure out what the puzzle needs to look like.
Well, and again, this is great. And what I appreciate about your answers, Justine, is really, once again, digging into it and want to pick up on, as you said, like they are simple and it's the power of simplicity. And then you used a very powerful, we were talking about words earlier, a powerful follow up word, which was discipline.
Yeah.
So it's simple to say, and oh, well, put my phone away. The discipline to do that
Oh yeah.
is next level. And to your point, I love what you're sharing as well. How many of us, personally, professionally, pull out phones, are distracted by them, we're not fully present. And so this is such a great insight. And then I would also share, which I really appreciate too, where you're talking about that exercise, and thank you for sharing that. And then the paraphrasing and what gets in the way. And once again, I love this concrete behavior. And they found it in listening research, which is also why I love what you're talking about, which is we can get so excited to participate or contribute to the conversation. We're not like,
No.
okay, Justine is going, my turn's next, and all I'm thinking about is
About
all the brilliant insight I'm going to add to this topic.
yeah,
And then it's, hey, what did Justine say? And it's like, well, and
I
we're
don't remember.
stuck. It's so good because
Yeah.
that can be a part of. And so thank you for slowing the tape down and reminding each of us the importance of that. And the time is flying. We're almost at it's incredible. And
Yeah.
we've covered so much. And there's another area that I'd love to get your take on, because once again, it is first and foremost in people's minds. You talked about an emphasis around well-being, talked about resiliency. I'd love to get your take on this in terms of what are some things that you do to keep your well-being, your resiliency top of mind, and some that self-care, if you will. And then I'd
Yeah.
also love to get your insights around, and then as president and CEO, how do you bring that in an organizational context with your senior leadership team, and then distill that throughout the organization? If you can, I'd love to kind of unpack those questions through those two lenses.
Yeah, no, no, no. So, so first of all, I mean, kudos because it's such an important topic, right? This well-being, and I have to confess, like, I don't have it sorted out. It's a good thing my kids are not on this podcast, Craig, because they'd say, "Oh no, mom certainly doesn't have sorted this out." So let's be really clear about that. Um, but and then I'll say this: I think one, I think you have to believe in it.
Mhm.
And if there isn't enough example around you, I'm sure you and I could come up with quite a few of them that can really kind of put it in front of your face in terms of the importance of it, right? What happens if you don't? I think I'm going to go back to, I guess, a word I said before is to try to have some discipline. And my batting average is probably not great on that one, but I admire those that are really able, to I'll take a weekend as an example. You can decide I'm going to work hard during the week, and in the weekend I really dedicate it to the family. Like, figure out what boundaries or formula can make sense for you. And I'd say that sometimes over the years, what has frustrated me, and you get all sorts of these little insights, is it always seems easy on a piece of paper, and then reality hits, right? Like, so we all have our reality. So to me, if you allow reality to put a barrier in front of you, that's not good. So just take in those little tips, apply your reality to it, and don't be hard on yourself because you're not hitting the average. Be encouraging yourself because you're doing something, and over time that's going to get better. And I think we say it, but we're not kind enough to ourselves on it. You talked about, like, with your leadership team. The often what I talk to people about, and I think it's not just leadership team, I think it's about the health of an organization. I call it is, once upon a time you got to stop the conveyor belt, and it's a really hard button to push. Nobody wants to stop, because then, depending if it's a project, if it's like, it's just like, oh no, we can't until the day you say stop. And then I have yet to see or an opportunity where that was done, that people, if you do it right, don't come out of it and say, thank God we did that. So I would say that as the CEO, if I look at my direct team, it is super important to be the one that can push the button to stop. And if you're willing to push it, I think then others will come to the table. But don't be the one that they run into your office and say, you better stop it. That's part, I consider that a core part of my job, to look at when I have to push the button in order to do that. And I'd say, Craig, too, is again, maybe it's a bit about my organization, but I think there are really neat things that are accessible to people. I think we have to talk about it first, because in some instances it's still a taboo. Let's be honest, I think. And I think there's some simple things you can do. Like, we just launched actually today, employee resource group on mental wellness, for example, right? And on resiliency. And there's things that don't have to be like a big program and so forth. But when they see that you're supportive of it, I think it sends a pretty clear message. and to also share with people that, it's not because of your role that, you end up being the guru about it. There's an anecdote that comes to mind, Craig, which is I was at this conference, and when you prepare all your questions, and then the interviewer pulled a Craig Dowden on me and said, "Hey, I've got a question for you." He's and you haven't been prepared for this one, Justine. So I'm like, okay, what is it going to be? And it was interesting because I was expecting something like a policy, or what do you think is going to happen in Canada? And he's like, "What does Justine do on the weekend?" I went, "Oh." And it totally caught me off guard. But then I guess I was authentic, and I said, "Well, I get up on Saturday, I get the two dogs, and I go for a walk, and then I do my groceries, and so." And then, funny enough, afterwards, people came to see me, and they're like, "You couldn't have answered that better." Because I think people would expect that I'd say, "Well, on the weekend I get up and I read the Financial Times, and then I have my coffee, and then," you know what I mean? And then I'm like, "No, no, no, no. I just, to be honest, I don't have the time to do that." But I think it's important to recognize that, and we can convey such a powerful message when you actually share how hard it's for you too, right? And I think people relate to that a lot. And I guess for me, it is true that I find it super hard. But I'd say in closing, it's very much about focus on what you can do, not on everything you aren't doing, and just find those moments, right? And just cherish them. And I think when you do that, it encourages you to do more.
It's great, and thank you. And once again, what I love in your answers to my questions is, it's providing a roadmap, because there are different aspects of it. And one that I want to pull out for people, because it is an incredibly valuable insight, is around that self kindness, that self compassion, and accepting where we are in our journey. And as you say, focusing on what we have accomplished versus, oh, well, I could have run for 3 hours versus, well, I ran for two, or whatever. I went for a 5 minute walk. That's great. And maybe next time I'll do six. It's
Six.
about how are we showing up, and that, hey, successful high five, that I'm looking out for myself. This has just been great. You've answered all of, like, we've just gone into so many directions and some unplanned in terms of because of the
Yeah.
energy, and I love it. Is there anything we haven't touched on today? Because I really appreciate your passion for leadership, for impact, for being observational, because I think all of us can learn from there. Anything, any final thoughts you want to leave with the listeners before we close? Because this has just been so enjoyable for me.
Yeah, no, no. Well, first of all, thank you, Craig, again for the invitation. And I guess, I mean, for me, what I would leave the audience with is maybe from the lens of a CEO. Um, you know, uh, and this might seem a bit contradictory, right? But you've got to get ready for your board of directors. You got your you got to do all that stuff, right? But don't ever put at the bottom of your list going out there and connecting with your staff and your customers, right? So if it, so for me, that's what keeps me passionate, and to me that's what my job is first and foremost, and that should feed how I come up at the board, the audit committee, all of those things that are super super important. But the day I allow myself to take that over against maintaining that connection, I think is where it's probably time for me to not be the CEO anymore, right? And I say that knowing it's probably a little bit contradictory to how some might see it. But to at the end of the day, regardless of your company and who what you're leading, whatever that customer at the end is, don't ever lose sight of that, because that's ultimately what we're here to bring good to. So that's probably what I would say as a closing thought, is to keep that balance at the forefront all the time.
Well, and what I love what you're sharing, it's the power of relationships,
Yeah,
and you said connection, and then what I really appreciate of what you're astutely observing is that provides fuel for the other thing, like the other
totally.
activities that we're doing. And I think that's so important, because we can get that backwards, kind of almost flip the script on that, and then those relationships are secondary, and then we suffer for that physically, psychologically, emotionally, as do
Everything.
others. So I just think what a brilliant way to close this. Well, thank you, Justine, for everything you brought to the conversation today. This was just such a treat. and so many valuable insights on this. And for those of you who've tuned in, thank you so much for your ongoing support. Looking forward to seeing you on a future episode. Bye for now.